right, good morning, USENIX Security 2017. Thank you so much for inviting me here to speak. So I'm going to talk about defensive security in modern newsrooms. This is a generalized title, but I'm really going to be talking about the Intercept and First Look Media, which is where I work. And so, as David has already said, my role is lead security architect. Obviously, this is a title I invented for myself because it sounds very cool. And prior to that, I was a Tor developer and a Debian developer, which I mentioned mostly so you know that I come from a free software hippie background, which I think gives me a different perspective from, let's say, a reverse engineer or something like that. And when I worked at Tor, I learned a lot about activists specifically and how they interact with computers. I was there from 2009 to 2014, and I mostly worked on the Tor browser, and so probably a lot of you are familiar with this project or have used it or use it regularly. And one of the things that I learned from activists is that any failure with the technology can be catastrophic, and I don't mean catastrophic in the sense of like catastrophic data loss, you've lost access to your information because of a bug or something like that. I mean actually jail or sometimes murder. Really, really horrible things can happen if you get something wrong with technology. And working on that, there's a lot of really cool free software licenses that are zero liability, but when you work on software like this, it's not zero liability. You have to really take very seriously the lives that you are trying to protect. And the other thing is that a lack of tech skills can lead to exploitation in these communities. They're very vulnerable. And by exploitation, obviously, I mean in the technical computer sense of the word, but also they're vulnerable to like social engineering. And so when we were dealing with a lot of, the rise of anti-censorship and the rise of, censorship and trying to circumvent it, there were a lot of like snake oil companies that try to take advantage of this. And if they looked good, people would just use them. And we kind of had this problem at Tor where we didn't, it didn't look that good, which is how the Tor browser got started. We needed people to not mangle the way it was working and just make sure it worked well the first time. And the other thing is that a lot of activists just won't use a Western technology or, their friends in their local community have a specific type of technology that they trust that no security expert would ever recommend. And sometimes you get this confluence of people who want to use this technology and journalists who have to talk to them, right, if they're reporting on the Middle East or something like that. And so then you have a situation where both people are using insecure technology. And so, before I started getting involved in really journalistic practices, this was on my mind a lot. And so the history of, I guess, computer security-oriented reporting kind of started with WikiLeaks, right? Like, they anticipated these huge leaks. They anticipated that pervasive crypto was going to be necessary for people in order to make changes against their government because governments were going to crack down and it was going to take place digitally. And they were also one of the first news outlets to use a Tor hidden service to receive submissions. And eventually now we see that that's much more common with SecureDrop. Basically every respectable news site has a SecureDrop instance where they can receive leaks. And then 2013 happened, and you probably all recognize this young man, Edward Snowden. He's known for leaking large troves of documents to Laura Poitras and Glenn Greenwald. And so, and they were like this, and we discussed, and I remember this being sort of the most horrible professional vindication that anyone could have hoped for. We had been warning people about the potentials for mass surveillance and how horrible it would be. But when this came out, we were like, oh, wow, it's real, and it's actually worse than we thought. And at this time, trainings sprang up all over the place. There were lots of journalists who, and lots of activists too, and just kind of anyone who was like, actually, I don't want people to have all this information. They were suddenly interested in these tools that we had been trying to work on and promote for all these years. And so training sprang up all over the place. People wanted to know about PGP, OTR, Tor. At the time, Signal was called Text Secure, and Tails. And part of it was that any journalist who wanted to work with this information needed to know how to use those tools, because otherwise they wouldn't be allowed to even look at any of the documents. And additionally, people started to realize that if they wanted to be able to receive this information, they had to also have the technical ability to get this information. And so, because of the difficulty of publishing these documents, Pierre Omidyar founded First Look Media in October 2013, and then the Intercept was created with Laura Poitras, Glenn Greenwald, and Jeremy Scahill in February 2014. And the other thing that was kind of going on at this time is that usable security in general got bigger. I forgot to mention this in my last slide, but the response from a corporate level to some of this, I mean, like, how many of you can believe that just a few scant years ago, basically most of the internet was unencrypted, right? Like, it was just plain text all over the place. Nobody cared about mail transport. And, you know, I really want to give a shout out to the Google Chrome security team, because they placed usable security as a very high priority for them. And they spent a lot of time on really small nuance, like, how do you represent that this is a valid certificate? How do you, not even just how do you know, which is important, but how do you communicate that to a user so that they're like, automatically they say, okay, this is good, or automatically they say, like, no, my instincts tell me something is off about this. And additionally, companies, you know, such as Apple started making full disk encryption the default, right? Like, all of these things started happening in response to these disclosures, and usable security became very important. And so a lot of people think that I'm a trainer, and it's true, like, some of my job is about training people how to use technology. But I think the difference between training and organizational security is that training is like, wash your hands, you know? It's cold season, you don't want to get a cold, wash your hands. But organizational security is actually having, like, a water sanitation plan, right? Like, what good is washing your hands if the water is dirty? It doesn't, you know, you're still going to get sick, you're still going to pass around disease. And organizational security is kind of the bedrock on which you can place those best practices that you try to teach people. And so, I need some water, sorry. And so, probably some Dijkstra fans in the audience, yeah? Yeah. And so I really like this quote. It's from his paper called, hang on a minute, I'm sorry. The paper is called, it's about teaching computing science. And kind of the main thrust of the paper, or at least one of the larger points, is that it's really hard to teach computer science because computers are really, really novel, and people have a hard time understanding novelty, and so they revert to analogies. And sometimes analogies are never perfect. That's why they're analogies. And in this case, I think that we have reverted to a lot of very militaristic analogies that are not particularly helpful. They immediately place people in either a victim or attacker role, when kind of the larger system is a little bit more organic. It's not that there aren't victims or attackers. It's just that when you're dealing with kind of a vulnerable population who's actually in danger, couching it in those militaristic terms militarizes the work that they do. And there was this post by Meredith Whittaker when she was at Google. And I love Meredith Whittaker. She's one of the great kind of ethical thinkers, I think, of our time. And she wrote this post talking about, you know, what if we reimagine computer security as an act of caring for, as a practice of maintenance and nurturing, as an act of making sure that the systems respect the boundaries and operate within those boundaries. You know, and this can still be a rigorous science. It's just a slight shift of how you view it. And this is something that I really try to promote in my day-to-day job, because I don't have the luxury of not working with people. My whole job is to work with people and to make them feel safe. And actually, I don't think it's a luxury not to work with people. Let me be clear about that too. I like to work with people, I like to work with smart people, and I like to help them achieve good things. And so The team that I work for is diverse and very multidisciplinary. It's, there's me, the microphone banger, the security person, my boss, who's the research director, and if you don't know, researchers at news organizations basically assist the journalists with like digging up dirt about, whoever they're reporting on. But they also have, very rigorous research abilities. There's an archivist on my team. One of my first jobs was creating a system to kind of protect and provide access to the Snowden archive. So, of course, we have an archivist, but she also helps us organize and deal with a lot of interesting data because we get a lot of interesting data sets. And then we have two software developers that we work with in the research team. And again, this is like, I mostly work on special journalistic projects. So this is like, oh my God, we got this crazy data set. What do we do with it? And this is the team that I work with. And it's very close-knit and collaborative. We try to stress, empathy, compassion, collaboration, consensus-oriented decision-making, because the thing is that the software isn't there yet. Like, as much as people would like to valorize computer software, like, it just doesn't work that well for most of the purpose that at least journalists need it. And so we have to kind of work together to reinforce our team in a way that computers can't really do. And so this is kind of the part about the actual nuts and bolts of what we have to deal with. And so the first thing, if you're going to have a threat model, you have to know, well, what are my assets? And our number one asset is people. It's not just the journalists and other people in our company we work with. It's also people they're communicating with, people who could be harmed or helped by their story. We have to always keep them in mind that out of everything, they are the most valuable part of this. And when it comes to journalists, I mean, there are so many different attacks that you could have. It's not necessarily like a big, bad, formidable, state actor who's got tons of resources who's going to attack you. It's, what if my journalist writes about Nazis in the U.S.? Like, can we withstand like a Nazi troll storm? I don't know. And you have to be worried about that. You have to be worried about journalists being doxxed, swatted, harassments. They receive death threats on a regular basis. And it's a really scary time, especially in the US, to work in journalism. And we also have to worry about things like journalists being arrested, or detained, either in the US or abroad just for their actions. Like if they happen to go to a protest or something like that, there's a chance they could be brought up on federal charges for rioting. Like these are real concerns that we have to have about their actual physical well-being. And then, of course, we have the sensitive documents and data sets, which are both an asset and sometimes a threat, because you receive them and you don't know, like, this document is interesting, but, is it like also some WannaCry stuff? Or, what is this document going to do? And so we treat those basically like they're, I don't know, like some kind of toxic biohazard that could be really interesting and maybe eventually could go out into the public. Then we have the computers and devices, right? Like they could be stolen, there's so many things they could be hacked into, and they have a lot of interesting information about the journalists and the people they're talking to. They sometimes contain either complete or partial data sets of stories that are working on. They contain information about the stories that are being worked on and could give an attacker hints where to look next. There's the operational knowledge, which is sort of, we have a bunch of different levels of how we protect information and who has access to it, and that operational knowledge about how we take care of all of those things is also very sensitive in and of itself. And in addition, the protocols and procedures for actually accessing all of the different systems with sensitive information in them. And then these are some of our threats. These are mostly, so these are the legal threats, right? Like, if you don't know who these people are, God bless you. But the first one is Jeff Sessions. I asked our graphic designer, can you make it look like one of those viruses that's spreading across your screen, but with their faces? And this is the beautiful piece of art she came up with. So Jeff Sessions, the Attorney General of the US, and Donald Trump, the President, have both promised to crack down on leakers. And cracking down on leakers means cracking down on journalists, basically. They have mentioned, maybe they're open to subpoenas for news organizations. And this informs a lot of our security posture, because the security threat of an overly broad subpoena is a little bit different when everyone can be compelled to give up passwords or something like that, and when you are, legally not allowed to destroy anything. It's a lot different than when you're just trying to protect it against hackers who are more skilled, but kind of, less evil and powerful in many ways. And then, of course, there's kind of, your standard everything threat model, which is all of these groups, right? Hostile foreign actors, both government and non-government, hostile domestic actors, mostly government, mercenary and, kind of chaos monkey hackers who just want to see if they can get in, figure out what's going on, maybe release some stuff and humiliate you. And then there's insider threats, which I hesitated to phrase it that way, because you could have malicious people inside your company, and you should always develop your systems such that any, and this is something I learned from Tor, any single or a couple of bad points along the way shouldn't be able to give up too much information about you. And so we try to design systems like that, because even if the insider threat is not malicious, it could be someone who just made a mistake, right? They left their laptop unlocked at a coffee shop and someone took it, and suddenly they have access to all of their email or whatever. And so we have to keep these in mind when we're developing systems, and it's pretty complicated. And then there are the technical threats, and these are honestly pretty standard, like phishing, malware, network penetration, theft. We have decided that USB, Thunderbolt, and firmware attacks are definitely within our threat model. I don't know how many of you agree that some of our journalists or people working for us are worth $1 million iOS exploit, but we think that at least a few of them are. And so whenever possible, we try to take things down to the physical level, which is why we consider this a real threat. We do have our limits. Acoustic cryptanalysis, if you want to get us with that, go for it. I don't know. I don't know how to protect. That is a crazy attack, and that's my reaction to it. And so some of the solutions, and so when I say general population, I mean all of First Look Media. Because again, if you're going to attack someone, you're probably not going to come for me. You're probably going to go for the receptionist first and try to bounce around inside. Chris McNabb wrote a post a few months ago about Alexei Beslan, I think his name is, who is someone responsible for a bunch of huge data breaches of big companies. And what he does is he outlines basically all of the different ways that this person was able to gather this information. And the things that really stood out to me, yes, we consider esoteric attacks as a real problem and something we have to try to defend against. But, obviously we're more concerned about kind of banal attacks. And the two that really stood out to me were the lack of two-factor auth on internal applications and credential reuse. And so, so I have basically mandated that we have two-factor auth on pretty much everything. Internal services we spin up, external services, and luckily basically everyone in the security and tech team is in agreement with this. I think it's not literally everywhere, but it's in as many places as possible. And we also offer to people to help them set up 2FA on their personal accounts and explain to them how someone might get into their personal account and then move to their business accounts and then move into some of the more vulnerable population of the Intercept who really have stuff that they need to protect. And we promote this mostly in the way of, again, kind of going back to the public health comparison, we promote it as herd immunity, which is something that people intuitively understand as a good thing. Helping people develop intuition about computers is hard because they're weird and confusing and how do you, the other day I was riding my bike and this little girl was walking across the street and she saw me coming and was just smiling and I'm like, I'm going to run over you if you don't move. It didn't even occur to her. She didn't know, right? Something as basic as kind of this instinct for self-preservation has to be taught. And a lot of computer people are taught this at such a young age that they don't remember that they ever didn't have intuition about it. So of course, when it comes to credential reuse, password managers are something that we mandate as well. I was lucky that I got to recommend password managers based on a personal conversation with Tavis Ormandy, and so that gave a lot of strength to my argument. Everybody, from the day I started, like my entire interview process and everything took place over encrypted email. So encrypted email is an organizational-wide thing that people are taught on their first day. Obviously, full disk encryption, we're moving to UB keys so that people don't have their PGP keys on their computers. We set firmware passwords on people's computers in case they're stolen or someone tries to modify them. VPNs, kind of some of this is best practices, some of this is a little bit, I think it's probably unusual for like non-technical people. And then additionally, we provide border crossing consultations. We're very concerned about people being detained. We never know when that could happen. And this is partially to make sure that we don't lose very sensitive data if they get detained, but it's also to help people, again, back to developing intuition. Like it's really, threat modeling is hard. Threat modeling for yourself when you have no experience with threat modeling is impossible. Like there's just absolutely no way you're gonna get it right. And so in having these conversations, we explain to people kind of like how you go from one threat level to another and how current circumstances affect that. Because again, like when we're doing herd immunity, we have to explain to people that just because your threat profile is like this today doesn't mean tomorrow it's going to be the same. It's, there are factors outside of your control that influence this. And then of course we, network segmenting and ongoing training initiatives to make sure that people are kind of kept up to date on best practices. And so for the Intercept, we use a lot of air gaps, but as Matt Blaze observes, not connected to the internet is a bold and rarely justified claim. So we do our best. We try to air gap them at a hardware level, but if anyone knows how to verify that a computer is definitely 100% for sure air gapped, please let me know, because I don't know. But seriously, we do have a lot of air gap infrastructure, like multiple computers, air gap networks. All of our journalists are trained extensively on not only air gaps in general, like what they mean, but also we have different types of air gaps with different operating systems that are used for different purposes. And so they also understand within the constellation of an air gap computer how you choose the kind that you need to work on and under what circumstances you might need to do that. We have tight integration between the teams, which is to say, like, security is very embedded in all of the teams, and we try to, consistently pass on information about security because we need to make sure everyone is up to date. And frankly, there's only 2 people on the security team at the Intercept. It's me and Micah Lee, and that's it. So we have to try to, force multiply, I guess. When we work with the software engineers, we try to make them write specs and include a threat model. A lot of software engineers, in my experience, do not threat model their software. They don't think about, just basic types of abuse. And they certainly are not generally equipped to think about, okay, so I have to defend against Russia, China, the US, Nazi hackers, every other kind of hacker. How do I do that? What might they want to do? And so, so I'm very involved with the software engineers and trying to help them with the threat modeling for their software. We also have threat assessment documentation, which is just basically, a list of like the most bland type of documents you could receive, which is, for example, a public leak, right? That is just, how do you deal with that? And it's basically like, I don't know, throw it on Google Docs and look through it. It's probably fine. To something where somebody leaks you a very, very sensitive, highly classified piece of information, which is, you should in all cases set off a 5-alarm fire where you shut it down, you immediately convene a team to discuss how you're going to talk about it and with whom. So it kind of runs the gamut from there. A lot of stuff that we deal with falls kind of in the middle where it's sensitive for a while and then it isn't. And we have to write a lot of customized in-house software to deal with documents. Part of this is just because, you have to write customized software sometimes. But a lot of it is because proprietary software just doesn't meet our needs. And we have extra physical security for the Intercept, and obviously I can't get into much detail about that, but people have told me I need to stop buying safes and locks, and I am telling them that I don't. I have to keep buying them. And so some of the technical challenges when you're dealing with high security stuff is that, especially if you're working on air gaps, you have to clone so much infrastructure. We have to clone Wikipedia, Stack Overflow. If you've ever tried to work with proprietary software on air gaps, it's almost impossible now because they expect everything to be connected to the internet. A lot of like modern versions of Microsoft Windows, you can't even register without an internet connection. And for other types of software, there's generally like this very complicated Rube Goldberg-esque like method for activating software over the phone it's just a nightmare. So proprietary software is part of the reason that we've gone to customize in-house software. Has anyone here ever tried to do programming on an air gap? It's horrible. Yeah, it's horrible. Especially modern programming languages also expect you to be on the internet all the time. I was trying to write something in Rust one time, and I realized I was going to have to maybe download every single package, but there was no clear way to do that. So I just made a list of the top 100, declared them as dependencies, and did a cargo build, and I had them. But I mean, it's a nightmare trying to develop on an air gap system, even if you're sitting right next to a computer or an internet-connected computer. It's also very hard to know when files are malicious. I mean, this is probably if I had number one request for all of these technical challenges, it would be a way to actually use some of the kind of malware analysis tools without the internet. Because sometimes we receive files, we don't know what's in them, and we can't upload them to VirusTotal, obviously. I mean, that would be crazy. So we can't tell, and the journalists want to know because they would like to eventually move them to their computers, and we're like, sorry, you're on an air gap for the rest of your life. And then journalistic speed versus slow security mechanisms. Sometimes you have to make technical trade-offs because the journalists don't want to get scooped, and this is always a very scary situation. And then there's kind of psychological challenges of dealing with this, which is that people are really, really scared about all of this stuff. I mean, there's so much that is unknowable about computers, even to computer experts. And non-experts, they're just like, I don't know, computers make me anxious, so I'm not going to think about it. And this is another reason why we push the public health kind of framework, because we just tell people, like, we're not going to shame you, we're not going to make fun of you, but we need to know if you've done something. We need to figure out, we need you to disclose, we need you to give us this information and be forthcoming so that we can deal with the problem, so that we can figure how does this influence our kind of systemic approach to this entire problem, and what can we do to make it easier so that this doesn't happen again next time? Security best practices change frequently. You have to really get people used to kind of being a little bit uncomfortable with that, because sometimes you could be using something and it works really great one day, and then suddenly it's a bad computer program and you can't use it anymore. And people, once they get kind of used to their workflow, they don't want to switch things, and it's very hard to get them off of those things. So trying to just get people used to the fact that they just have to sometimes change what they're doing is very important. And as I said, like, developing intuition is just, it's really hard. It takes a long time. It takes really years and years for people to figure out not only is something dangerous, but is this a point at which I should wonder if it's dangerous, right? And part of a security person's role, I think, is displaying that also, like, I don't know all the answers. I don't have any kind of hacker bravado where I'm like, yeah, I've seen this before. A lot of these things we haven't seen before. There's no model for dealing with air gap systems with non-technical people, for example. And I don't always know the answer when something's about to be published, if it's okay. We do the best we can, and so showing people that even the experts don't have all the answers, and showing what our thought process might be when we encounter a situation where we don't know the answer is very helpful, because it allows them the space to also ask questions and begin to wonder and develop their own intuition and trust their gut. And so this is my very good graphic skills here. I'm going to give you a quick case study of a project that we did to kind of show you how all of this works in practice. The very tall person is me, because I'm a very tall person, and then the S is for security. The J, that's the journalist, and then the B, that's my boss, the research director. And so we had a journalist. She received some documents from a source that she didn't know. And we didn't know anything about the documents except what the source had said. She knew at this point, don't ever click on attachments. They could be really dangerous. Even if they're not dangerous, they could be doing network callbacks that alert someone to the fact that you have them. So, no clicking on attachments, especially from sources you don't know. And so she came to me and she said, I have these, what do I do? And we kind of convened a team, we discussed it, and I said, okay, my default is to always kind of fail closed. Put it on the most secure thing you can, get an air gap, use Tails. It's kind of a disposable operating system. If it blows up Tails, whatever, And so, so she did that, and the documents were valid. They were like real in the kind of technical sense of the word and not being exploits, but also real in the sense of having information that was newsworthy. So we expanded the team to include an editor, and then we had to go over all of these different considerations. And we immediately established that it was a newsworthy topic. And then, by then, the journalists had done some kind of assessment of the documents and their content. And, we learned from that, like, who and what do we have to protect? And the who and what, it could be the documents themselves, but the documents themselves, in this case, contained a lot of personally identifying information of very innocent people who, if this information got out in any way, it could potentially be really, really harmful to them. And additionally, the documents were almost certainly going to piss off the company if they found out that we had them. And so we figured, well, that company might want the documents, and what would they want to do with them? Sometimes, there are a lot of different people who could want a lot of different documents. Governments could want access to, governmental documents we have about their enemies. And in this case, we figured it was probably going to just be the company. Maybe they had some rivals, but they wouldn't know we had it. And then what would they want to do with them? And sometimes they might want to leak the documents themselves, use them for their own personal stuff. In this case, our concern was that they might want to destroy the documents. And so, of course, like the first thing we did was make a secure backup of them somewhere else. And once we had decided all that, then it becomes an issue of, well, how do you research them? And it turns out researching stuff in documents is very complicated because, especially, again, in the legal environment in which we operate, we have to worry about subpoenas a lot, like subpoenas of big companies. And sometimes we have to say, well, we can't use Google because if they get a subpoena about what we're looking for, they'll probably just turn over the information, and it could be harmful. And so in those cases, we had to make decisions about, well, okay, you can research this, but you can only use Tor. Or sometimes we might tell people you can only research this from like a distant location, over Tails, over Tor, nowhere near the office, right? Like it really depends. And then there were some technical questions, such as the source was sending updates. And if you work on air gaps, basically the way you transfer information between a regular computer and an air gap is you have to burn CDs because we're scared of, USB devices and all of the diseases they have. And so, but the source was sending a lot of updates. So, what were we going to do? How are we going to facilitate this kind of transfer where the journalists could actually look at this information? And there were a lot of documents. I mean, I think there were hundreds. There were hundreds of documents, and it was a little bit, and they were very long documents, like 20 pages a piece. So it was a lot of information. At this point, we had also brought in some other journalists who were experts on the topic, but they worked remotely. And so we couldn't, the air gapping thing wasn't really working that well, especially not for collaboration. And we had to decide, like, how do you communicate with the source? What is the safest way? Like, what is the source's technical skill level? What is their threat profile? How, what would happen? Do you have a plan for if suddenly they get found out and they're in trouble, and how do you deal with that? And what's the safest way to communicate about the story? I mean, basically, we assume, or we treat all of the computers and all of the journalists like they're under surveillance, whether or not that's true. And so we have to figure out, like, well, how do we communicate? And could we, because of this story, be subject to subpoenas in the future? And so do we want to store that communication anywhere, or do we not? And so these are all considerations. And I want to make it clear, like, the story was sensitive, but it was nowhere near our highest sensitivity level. And this is how we had to treat it. And so the answer that we came up with, it was fairly simple. We put air-gapped virtual machines on the journalists' laptops so that they could, easily move documents into them, but still open them. Because as I said, we had determined they were not really malicious. We were just concerned about the company being alerted to us having them in case of network callbacks. And we also needed a way to just, more quickly move in like news sources for the journalists. Obviously, use Tor, use Signal, research over Tor, collaborate and discuss this story over Signal with disappearing messages. And then we wrote some custom software for collaboration, which we put kind of on a, more secure internal network, and it required multiple layers of authentication. VPN, two-factor auth. You had to be a known user. You couldn't create new accounts. And we added, of course, tons of monitoring and alerting and stuff like that. And so then the end result of this, the story I'm talking about, it was about TigerSwan, they were like this mercenary group that were hired to crack down on the Dakota Access Pipeline protesters. And they used all these kind of like horrible paramilitary tactics. And now, because of this story, they're in a lot of trouble. There are lawsuits against them in North Dakota. I don't think their company is probably going to survive it, but I don't know. And so anyway, so that is just, obviously I can't talk too much about like the most sensitive stories we work on, but I hope that you can infer from this that the very sensitive ones have even more rigorous and strict, rigorous and strict security protocols around them. Some of them are so strict that a lot of people in the company don't even know they're being worked on. They know maybe there's like a group of people doing something, but they have no idea what the story is about. Nothing ever touches the internet. You're not allowed to talk to other people about it. It's heavily compartmented. The way that it is stored is limited, and multi-access is required. And so they're very complicated. And so that is basically my talk about newsroom security. I hope that was somewhat informative. I want to give a shout out to my team. Lynn Dombeck, Michael Lee, Talia Cooper, Akil Harris, Wesley Henning Palermo, Moisaya Destuhi Cho, and the Intercept and First Look Media for all of their help and support in this talk. And with that, I will take questions. Thank you.
It seems like because you're talking about companies hacking you being in your threat model, how often do you see companies hacking? We don't really see it. It's not, honestly, I don't think we have great data. And I think because I work on mostly air gap stuff, I in particular don't have that much insight into the networking stuff, which is taken care of by the networking team. But I haven't seen anything about, kind of companies hacking us. It's just, if they decide to, we have to be prepared. Yeah. Sorry. Preparedness is excellent.
No one else? Oh, wait. Hello.
Hi. Hello. I have a question regarding like how you have changed procedures regarding document that will be exposed publicly, like a scan of document, like yellow dots from color laser printers.
So first of all, I can't talk at all about the Reality Winner case, and I am also legally not allowed to talk about any changes in procedures yet, but I hope that we will be announcing some stuff publicly soon. But I do think generally best practice is to retype documents or not publish them at all if you have any questions.
What do you do about personnel security? The way security clearances do go through very extensive background investigations. Of course, you can't do that kind of intrusive investigation. What do you do about personnel security?
Well, we do background checks, but a lot of it is kind of word of mouth. Is this person trustworthy? I personally, as a security person, am alerted about, if anyone has any questions or if they see, and it kind of turns me into a cop, right? But there is a limit to what we can do, which is why we try to compartment so heavily. But this is one of the risks that we kind of factor in as something that we don't really know how to defend against.
What are your thoughts about the trends in general of attribution and really understanding who's attacking you and why and that sort of thing?
I basically agree with everyone that attribution is inherently difficult. And I think the thing is that it's, for our purposes, it's maybe interesting, and I guess it could be potentially meaningful to find out if someone did that and who it was. But I think because it is so hard to figure that out, we just treat it like it could be anyone, and we don't really kind of pay that much attention to who it might be. I mean, of course, we try to monitor, ongoing threats and stuff like that, but I personally have just kind of given up on it. I mean, it seems like attribution functions mostly in a preponderance of evidence kind of way rather than a smoking gun. And even that, it just seems so impossible to tell that I just try to defend against everything.
Yeah, I think the technique can be, just like any security technique, can be a two-edged sword, right? And on one hand, you use this technique to protect journalists, and on the other hand, and I'm just wondering the similar technique, and to which extent it can be used by criminals to hide their trace, to destroy evidence, and to make sure, FBI, when FBI tracking, then they can get nothing.
Yeah. I mean, if the FBI attacks us, like, what can we do about that? And if it's someone else pretending to be the FBI, what can we do about that? Because we are in a position where it would be difficult for us to go to law enforcement if we needed help with these things, right? Like, many parts of law enforcement do not like the Intercept, and I would not expect them to be of great assistance if we did get hacked by, maybe foreign entities if they dislike them enough. I guess they might help them.
Thank you.
I want to ask about acceptance, about the culture of security.
Mm-hmm.
How effective do you think you've been, and how do you know? And because I can think that certainly people who feel that they're at risk will be eager to protect themselves, but there may be other people in the company who are involved who are not on the front line, who may not see the need personally.
Yeah, no, it's really hard, and something that I try to do is talk to people individually within the company, like not only the journalists at the Intercept, but new people, like try to sit them down and explain their role in this. And this is again where the herd immunity concept comes in, because they don't, if they're like, well, I'm not doing anything sensitive, I'm just emailing people about lunch orders or something like that. Well, that's true, but for example, we had someone, we were receiving packages, and someone took a picture of one of the packages and sent it to a person and said like, oh, hey, you have this package. And she didn't know what the package was, and she had no idea if it could be sensitive, but we do receive mail that could eventually be very sensitive. And so that was an example of something where someone had no idea it could be dangerous. We had to sit down and kind of talk and say, oh, no, look, these are the kind of threats. And it's just very complicated. So I basically just try to sit people down and explain to them and give them like a face to security, because especially for non-technical people, security is like this obscure thing that's for people in danger. It's not for them, and they don't see themselves as connected to the work that the Intercept does. And so I explained to them, like, no, you actually have a very important role in that. I mean, I don't know. I think it works because they seem to have higher compliance afterwards, but, we're not constantly surveilling people's laptops and seeing what they do. And it's a question of whether we really want to go that way, right? Like, really go like full intelligence agency on them. But we're not there yet. And so we just, do kind of the hippie thing of assuming best intentions and ability to learn and basic levels of competence. And I mean, so far, nothing I've worked on has gotten out. So I don't know.
Just to follow up on that. So, I mean, I could imagine that you would actually do things, I don't know if you would want to, but, for example, send phishing emails to see if people respond.
Yes. This is definitely a part of our security strategy.
Hi. With this high of a threat level, I'm wondering if you can comment on more of kind of on a journalistic angle, checking the authenticity and integrity of documents, and how you find, for example, a second anonymous source, or can you even do that once you receive these documents?
Checking the authenticity in the sense of like confirming them with an external party, or?
Yeah, that's exactly like, you have some PowerPoint deck and verifying that the information in there is actually correct. I imagine that normally this would involve calling, trying to seek out additional sources within a company, but in your threat model, that seems very risky.
Oh, it is very risky. I mean, but that does fall down to like kind of journalistic tradecraft. And a lot of journalists have sources within various agencies, the government, companies, or they know how to get to them. And so the part, and I can't really, I mean, I'm not a journalist. I've learned a lot about it. It's very challenging, and they're extremely savvy. The most I can do is say, okay, like, you want to talk to someone, what is the potential blowback for talking to them in an incorrect way? And try to just give them the tools to communicate with the people in a way that is like both effective and also safer.
Thanks.
You mentioned that you don't really want to approach law enforcement in a lot of cases. Have you considered whether there are other countries where it would be better for you to operate?
Well, yes. I mean, and we do have a branch in Rio, but I think that for the most part, the journalists want to continue to work here and to kind of fight against these laws and to like be on the ground and just, I mean, they're trying to hold powerful people accountable. And you can do that from far away. But I think that, there's something in the posture that's like, no, we deserve to be here. And if you want to come after us, you can do that, but you're in for a battle, basically, a protracted legal battle. We're going to try to make it hard for you from a security perspective, and it's like I think it would be safer in many cases, and it could potentially be the case that it becomes so unsafe in the U.S. that has to happen. But I think there's something really valuable in like staking your claim to a democratic nation and saying like, no, we belong here, and we're going to keep doing this. People coming. Who's going to be first? Oh, right.
You mentioned that you're able to personally sit down with a lot of the staff, go over the threat levels, the threat assessments. Do you find that the nature of your organization, the size of it, allows you to do that to make a more secure posture? Would it scale if you're at the Washington Post, New York Times, who are breaking a lot of news right now on sensitive topics? Do you think that you'd be as effective?
No. I mean, I would not be able to do anything but sit down with people. And so, it has to be short, and I haven't done it with every single person. It's just something that I'm starting to do more and more, because the thing that I have found is when I have sat down with people, if they do something right, they're very happy and they come and tell me about it. And that tells me that they feel like personally accountable to me, if not responsible for the overall security of the company, and they're happy that they learned this new skill and that they've implemented it correctly. And it doesn't scale for me personally, but I do think that it's a good approach for like a smaller company. There's one more. Yes.
Yeah. So you addressed this a little bit earlier, and this is a follow-up to another question. To what extent do you have to worry about accidental sort of the equivalent of someone writing down a password on a Post-it note? To what extent is that part of your threat model?
It's like nightly nightmares. Yeah, it's it's a really big problem. And luckily, I mean, I'm not the only person. Like, I'm the only person in New York who does security, but we also have an IT team, and we try to, I meet with them regularly, and they keep track of this stuff because they interact with the people in the company much more than I do. And so they monitor these kind of things. And we say, like, someone's writing down a password. What is it a password to? We have a protocol for changing it if we find out about these things. We make sure they know how to use a password manager, and that, in that case, maybe I do have a personal sit down with them and tell them how important this is. But no, that's a big part of the threat model as well.
Thank you.
Okay, so that is everyone. All right, thank you everyone for your time. Have a great USENIX.